You press your knee against his writhing leg, saw gripped in slick fingers, teeth clenched to muffle the next scream. Whether his or yours, you no longer know. Blood sprays up your sleeve like a red fountain. The bone cracks. You keep sawing. If you stop now, he'll die for sure. But if you keep going, he still might. The crowd behind you murmurs. One child vomits, and someone faints onto the floorboards with a thud. You don't look up. You can't. You whisper through your teeth. Almost there, even though you're not sure if that's true. Then the saw jolt's stuck. You blink and realize you've hit something you shouldn't have. And now they're all watching. In medieval Europe, surgery wasn't a profession bathed in glory. It was a sweaty, brutal trade, somewhere between butchery and performance art. Surgeons weren't doctors, not in the scholarly sense. They didn't study Galen in ivory towers, or, quote, Aristotle in Latin. They cut, they burned, they stitched. If you had steady hands and a strong stomach, you could become one. But the title of surgeon didn't mean respect. It meant risk for both patient and practitioner. One slip, one misplaced blade, and someone's brother, daughter, or lord would be dead. Not from the illness, but from you. And still, they kept coming, because when rot set in and fever burned, who else would dare to cut? In the great hierarchy of medieval medicine, surgeons weren't doctors. They weren't even close. While physicians read Greek in candlelit chambers and astrologers blamed illnesses on planetary misalignment, surgeons were elbow-deep in pus and blood, often treated like glorified butchers. The word surgeon itself came from the Greek chirurgia, handwork. And that was the problem. To cut flesh was to degrade oneself. In most medieval universities, touching a patient was beneath the dignity of learned men. So physicians diagnosed, apothecaries mixed potions, and surgeons, well, they sliced. Most surgeons came up through apprenticeships, not academia. They trained with barbers, monks, or older cutters, learning through repetition and error. And if you made too many errors, you disappeared, sometimes figuratively, sometimes in a dungeon. Curiously, this practical experience made surgeons more effective in emergencies than many physicians. They knew how to stop bleeding. They knew what a shattered femur looked like, but their low status persisted. In fact, some clerics debated whether surgeons even belonged in Christian society, claiming that by cutting open God's creation, they sinned against divine order. And yet, in every town and battlefield, it was the surgeon, not the scholar, who held the knife when it mattered. If your town didn't have a surgeon, you went to the barber. And if your town did have a surgeon, chances are he was also the barber. The medieval barber-surgeon was a dual-class profession, half hairstylist, half battlefield medic. One moment, they were trimming your fringe with a polished blade. The next, they were sawing off your infected toe or lancing a boil the size of a walnut. Convenience and catastrophe came bundled together. This wasn't just some quaint coincidence. In fact, a 1163 church council banned monks who'd been the primary surgeons from spilling blood. So, who took their place? The guys who already handled razors. Monks taught barbers how to cut. Barbers learned how to bleed. Thus, the profession evolved. The red and white barber pole? It's a leftover relic of this era. The red symbolizes blood, the white stands for bandages. Some even claim the pole itself represented the stick a patient would grip during bloodletting to make their veins pop. Decorative? Yes. Morbid? Also yes. Still, the barber surgeons remained the jack of all horrors for centuries. Need a tooth yanked, a boil drained, a bladder stone cracked in half. He'd do it for the price of a haircut. Maybe even throw in the haircut. Historians still debate how effective these men were. Some argue their trial-by-error approach saved more lives than the bookish physicians. Others point out the rampant infections and primitive methods. Either way, if you lived in the wrong century, the man holding the razor near your jugular wasn't always giving you a shave. Sometimes, he was giving you a second chance at life. No sterile gloves, no anesthesia, just a wooden table, some ropes to tie you down, and a surgeon's kit that looked more like a torture set than a toolbox. A typical medieval surgeon's arsenal included bone saws, curved scalpels, trepanation drills, cautery irons, hooked probes, and iron forceps. Each tool had a brutal beauty designed for efficiency, not mercy. Blades were rarely sharp enough for a clean cut, and few patients had the luxury of passing out before the worst began. Screaming was part of the procedure. The cautery iron heated in open flame was a particular favourite. It seared shut veins, sterilised wounds, sort of, and stopped bleeding. If you weren't burned after being cut, you weren't done. The smell of sizzling flesh was a sign of success. Some tools even had elegant names, like the crown trepan, used to bore holes into skulls and relieve pressure from brain injuries or evil spirits, depending on your medical theory of choice. Surgeons swore by it. Patients didn't usually live long enough to argue. What's curious is how little consistency there was across regions. One surgeon's prized gadget might be unknown to another. Some historians argue that personal toolkits were customized, handed down like family heirlooms. Others suggest most of these kits were assembled ad hoc, whatever a surgeon could afford or scavenge from a blacksmith. Regardless, the kit was a badge of pride. It told everyone, I can open you up, and maybe, just maybe, put you back together. But don't look too closely. That stain on the blade? Definitely not rust. Imagine watching your neighbour's leg get sawn off while munching a meat pie. In medieval Europe, that wasn't a joke, it was Tuesday. Public surgery was not only common, it was encouraged. Market squares, guild halls, even church steps, sometimes doubled as operating theatres. These weren't just emergencies made public, they were deliberate demonstrations of skill, training, and perhaps a bit of showmanship. Surgeons would often announce their upcoming procedures like street performers. Crowds gathered, children stared, apprentices took notes. Some brought stools and refreshments. For a society that lived nose to nose with death, watching someone's life dangle by a thread or a tendon was riveting. This practice wasn't as barbaric as it sounds. In the absence of formal medical schools for surgeons, real-life operations served as impromptu classrooms. Surgeons explained their incisions aloud. They pointed out anatomical landmarks. They bragged a little. If you were lucky, the patient survived, and you got a round of applause. If not, well, you blamed the infection or the devil. One fringe detail. Some of the earliest recorded dissections of human cadavers, rare and controversial at the time, were also done publicly, particularly in Italy. These were often accompanied by lectures, speculation, and sometimes outright theological panic. Today, scholars still debate whether public surgery improved surgical outcomes or just normalized trauma. Some argue it taught generations of surgeons faster, hands-on methods. Others point to the desensitization it caused, turning pain into a sideshow and patients into props. Either way, in a time before privacy, consent forms, or antibiotics, if you were going under the knife, it was best not to look up because 50 townsfolk might be looking right back down at you. By the late Middle Ages, surgery had become organized enough to be dangerous in new ways. Guilds sprang up, not just for blacksmiths or bakers, but for barbers and surgeons too. And with guilds came what every medieval tradesman craved: a license to cut. To be a master surgeon in a major city like Paris or London You needed credentials. These weren't earned through years in university, but through apprenticeships, journeyman trials, and public examinations. In some regions, you had to pass a live surgical demonstration in front of city officials, and, yes, the patient had to survive. Talk about pressure. The Parisian College of Surgery, for instance, emerged in the 13th century and issued formal titles to its members. London's Barbers' Company gained royal recognition in 1462. Their insignia, bloodletting basins and surgical tools as subtle as a head wound. And yet, outside the cities, it was still the Wild West of wound care. In villages and battlefields, many surgeons practiced without guild ties, credentials, or oversight. They might have learned their trade from a dying mentor, a battlefield camp, or simply their own failures. Interestingly, the church flip-flopped on surgical legitimacy. Some bishops condemned it as a blood-soaked offense to divine design. Others allowed surgical practice under strict moral supervision. Scholars still argue whether the rise of guilds helped professionalize medicine or merely monopolized it, gatekeeping the knife behind seals, stamps, and dues. So if you wanted to open someone's belly without landing in jail or a heresy trial, you'd better know your stitches and your signatures. Clean hands, sterile gowns, disinfected tools. These are modern fantasies. The medieval surgeon worked in a world where pus was considered a good sign. Hygiene, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. Surgeons reused blood-caked knives. They wiped tools on their aprons. Sometimes they didn't wipe them at all. A good cloth was more likely to be used for sweat than sanitation. If a wound oozed, festered, and turned white, that meant it was healing. They called it laudable pus, an optimistic term for an infection that often killed. Hand washing? Rare. Boiling tools? Unheard of. The idea that unseen filth could cause illness didn't take hold until the 19th century, long after thousands had died of wounds that should have been survivable. Sawdust was occasionally spread under operating tables, not for cleanliness, but to soak up the mess. Blood ran in rivulets off wooden planks. Patients were held down by friends or strangers. Anesthesia was wishful thinking. At best, you got a cloth soaked in vinegar or alcohol, and a prayer you'd pass out before the worst part began. Some surgeons did experiment with herbal antiseptics, garlic salves, wine rinses, honey dressings. There's even debate among historians whether certain apothecary surgeons stumbled onto rudimentary antiseptic properties by accident. But these were exceptions, not rules. And so, your chances of survival had less to do with the skill of the surgeon, and more with the resilience of your immune system, or the mercy of the infection. And if you got lucky, you limped away with your life and a lifelong terror of knives. Surgeons cut to save. But in the eyes of the medieval church, that wasn't always a virtue. Clergy and theologians wrestled with a thorny question. Was slicing flesh even to heal a defilement of God's creation? The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 came down hard. Priests and monks were officially banned from spilling blood. Healing the soul, yes. The body? Not if it leaked. This left a vacuum that lay surgeons stepped into, and they were never quite forgiven for it. While physicians aligned themselves with the heavens through astrology and humoral theory, surgeons were considered men of the earth, messy, bloody, and too close to mortality. Many saw them as morally suspect, a necessary evil, a reminder that healing often looked suspiciously like hurting. In some regions, surgeons had to take oaths before church officials to ensure their work wasn't heretical. They were even forbidden from practicing surgery on Sundays or holy days, as if divine rest included an exemption from gangrene. And yet, paradoxically, the church also needed surgeons. Pilgrimages were dangerous. Crusades bloodied thousands. Monasteries kept herbals, and anatomical diagrams. Monks couldn't cut, but they could teach. Some of the most detailed surgical treatises from the period were penned by religious scribes who'd never touched a scalpel. Historians still debate the church's exact stance. Was it outright hostility, cautious tolerance, or moral compartmentalization? The answer seems to be yes. Because when the bishop's nephew took an arrow to the gut, guess who got summoned first? Not the theologian, the man with the knife. No matter how steady your hand or sharp your blade, there came a day when every surgeon ended up on the table or under it. In a world without antiseptics, vaccines, or reliable painkillers, injury and illness came for everyone eventually, and surgeons weren't immune. The twist? They often knew exactly what was happening to them and what was about to happen next. You'd see it in their faces when the boil wouldn't drain, when the fever didn't break, when the leg wound started to smell sweet, that sickly scent of rot and regret. A surgeon knew gangrene by name. And he knew what came after. The bone saw, the belt between the teeth, and someone else, maybe your apprentice, doing the cutting. There are records of surgeons operating on themselves. A few legends even tell of men performing primitive amputations on their own limbs. Most didn't live to tell the tale. Even for surgeons, the margin between healer and victim was knife-thin. One particularly grim practice was using mirrors or drawings to describe your own procedure. A seasoned surgeon might sketch his own infected wound and guide a less experienced colleague through it, step by agonizing step. Cut here, avoid that artery, burn the end. Scholars still argue whether this self-awareness made surgeons more cautious or simply more fatalistic. Some believe it created a grim fraternity. Only those who had felt the blade truly understood the cost of using it. But whether patient or practitioner, the rules stayed the same. No anesthesia, no guarantees, and no one to blame but yourself. Every time a medieval surgeon picked up the blade, he played a game against death, and the odds were rarely in his favor. Surgery was the last resort, not the first option. You didn't go under the knife, unless there was no alternative. Not when herbs, prayers, and leeches had all failed. Not when the rot had crept in too deep. That's when people knocked on the surgeon's door desperate, trembling, often carried on a plank. A skilled surgeon knew how to move fast. Delay meant blood loss. Hesitation meant infection. But speed alone wasn't enough. You had to choose what to cut, where to burn, how to stitch. The wrong move turned a living man into a corpse with a clean incision. Success stories did exist. There were veterans with one leg, and merchants with repaired jaws. But every miracle carried a shadow patients who bled out, who screamed until their voices cracked, who died in their sleep days later from invisible poisons in the wound. And the surgeon? He carried all of them, not just in memory, but often in reputation. A town might whisper about your failures for years, or hail you as a miracle worker. The line between healer and executioner was drawn not in ink, but in blood. To wield the knife was to stand on the edge, not just of a table, but of fate itself. And sometimes, when the screams had faded and the fire in the brazier died down, you wondered, was that life you saved? Or just death, delayed? We remember kings and their crowns, saints and their sermons. But the surgeon? He vanishes somewhere between the battlefield and the back alley sleeves rolled, hands stained, nameless in the margins of history. He was not a philosopher, not a priest. He did not write theories or recite scripture. He cut, he sewed, he burned, and he hoped. His world was one of stench and steam-boiled linens, oozing wounds, iron tools cooled in blood. His patients arrived already half dead, their faces clenching against fate. There was no time for doubt, no margin for error, no anesthesia to soften the agony, just the blade and belief. And yet, within that gore-soaked world, there was something sacred, a defiance, a stubborn insistence that flesh could be fixed, that death could be postponed, that even in an age ruled by plague and prayer, the body still mattered. He worked without applause, without antiseptic, often without thanks. If he succeeded, the patient lived. If he failed, the priest took over. Either way, no monument was raised for the man who cut out the rot and held the line between suffering and stillness. Today, we sterilize, we scan, we sedate, but somewhere beneath the hum of fluorescent lights and the quiet beep of heart monitors, his shadow lingers, in every scalpel, in every stitch, in every moment when a surgeon takes a breath and makes the first cut, because the truth never changed. The body is fragile, the line is thin, and someone must cross it. So here's to the ones who did not with robes or relics, but with rough hands and rusted blades. They stood where others trembled. They healed what others feared to touch, and they did it with nothing but their courage, their instinct, and the knife.